Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In podcast number 102, we will begin a two-part treatment of the story in which Elijah leaves the scene and Elisha takes his mantle, quite literally. This episode is narrated in 2 Kings chapter 2. The reason for the two-part treatment is because the last incident after Elisha takes over is among the most bizarre and inexplicable found anywhere in the Bible. However, because it is there, we need to confront the story. We will do so in podcast 103. For now, let's deal with the transition from Elijah to Elisha. Many of the exploits of Elijah are described at the conclusion or toward the latter part of 1 Kings, including his famous contest with the prophets of Baal and his encounters with King Ahab of Israel. At this point in the story, he is about to leave. The operative word here is leave, not die. Elijah departs in one of the most spectacular scenes in the Old Testament. Indeed, this is how this final episode of Elijah's life begins. When the Lord was about to take up Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind. That stunning announcement sets the stage for the episode about to unfold. Just before this, we are told, Elijah and Elisha were traveling on their way from Gilgal. In 1 Kings 19, the Lord had already instructed Elijah to anoint Elisha as his replacement. That was the first time we had heard of Elisha, and the time when Elijah threw his mantle on Elisha. In this scene, Elisha is tagging along as with his mentor. At this juncture, Elijah says that the Lord has sent him to Bethel so that Elisha should stay put for a while. That's in verse 2. But Elisha refuses to stay, insisting that he accompany Elijah. So, both prophets head for Bethel. On the way, a number of prophets who resided in Bethel, called here the sons of the prophets, indicating a guild of some sort, appeared and spoke to Elisha. They wanted to know whether Elisha realized that the Lord would, quote-unquote, take your master, meaning Elijah, from over your head. That's the literal reading of Hebrew. Elisha pointed out that he knew this and told the prophets not to worry. That's in verse 3. It is not clear how the other prophets knew this or how Elisha himself knew. Was this a way to underscore the power of prophetic clairvoyance? Evidently, Elijah was not present during this exchange. Regardless, Elijah has another order for his mentee. Since the Lord wants him to go on to Jericho, he asks Elisha to stay right here in Bethel. Once again, though, Elisha wants to accompany Elijah, so they both go together to Jericho. That's in verse 4. Once there, another group of prophets who lived in Jericho appeared and spoke to Elisha. Again, somehow, this exchange did not include Elijah. The prophets from Jericho asked Elisha the same question as the Bethel prophets had asked. Was Elisha aware that this very day the Lord would take Elijah from over your head? That's in verse 5. Elijah said that indeed he was quite aware and admonished the prophets not to worry. For the third time, this pattern was repeated. Elijah tells Elisha that he should stay put because the Lord has asked him, that is Elijah, to go on to the Jordan. That's in verse 6. Elisha remained stubborn, insisting for this third time that he did not want to leave Elijah's side. So the two of them went together to the Jordan. This time, though, following from a distance were 50 prophets. Once at the river's side, Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water. This is, of course, reminiscent of what Moses had done at the Sea of Reeds in Exodus, only Moses used his rod, and Joshua had done at the Jordan in the book of Joshua. The waters parted so that the prophets could walk on dry ground. That's in verse 8. As though this had been planned from the outset, Elijah turned to Elisha, asking him what he wanted before he, Elijah, was taken from you, and that is namely from Elisha. Elisha had a ready answer. He wanted a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Apparently, this referred to Elijah's prophetic charisma, his fervor, his resolve, his connection to God, and the like. Sensing this, Elijah allowed that Elisha's request was not an easy one to meet. Not easy, but not impossible either. Elijah goes on to tell Elisha that in case he happens to see his mentor being taken from you, it would come to pass that he would indeed get a double portion of his spirit. In case Elisha does not see this, the endowment of the double portion of prophetic spirit will not take place. That's in verse 10. While these two prophets, one already famous, one soon to be famous, were still conversing, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared out of nowhere and separated the two men. That's in verse 11. Just as a burning bush signaled divine presence and a pillar of fire indicated divine presence, in this case, chariots and horses of fire symbolized extraordinary divine presence. Suddenly, Elijah, quote-unquote, went up to heaven, here considered the realm of the deity. Fortunately, Elisha saw the whole thing, thus fulfilling the condition that Elijah had set that would eventuate in his in receiving a double portion of Elijah's spirit. When he observed, Elijah could only say, my father, seemingly referring to Elijah as his mentor. Only after uttering these words did Elisha acknowledge, quote, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. That's in verse 12. That was the last time Elisha laid eyes on Elijah. The great Elijah was now gone. Elisha's reaction was not over, however. He tore into two his clothes. As well, he found Elijah's mantle that did not make the trip, so to speak, and went right back to the Jordan. That's in verse 13. Once there, he used the mantle to strike the water and wanted to know where the Israelite deity, Elijah's God, was. Obviously, God was right there, since the water immediately parted, allowing Elisha to cross the river. That's in verse 14. This was some scene. The prophets residing in Jericho saw Elisha. They remarked that Elijah's spirit now rests on him. Immediately they showed deference to Elisha by bowing. That's in verse 15. They have a strange request, though. They ask for permission to go and search for Elijah, thinking that God had spirited him away to some location where he could subsequently be found. 50 prophets made this request. Elisha refused to okay their request, however, but they kept badgering him until he, now shamed, gave in and allowed them to search. The 50 prophets searched for 3 days, but had no luck. Upon their return to Jericho, Elisha, in effect, told them that they would search in vain. That's in verse 18. Now that Elisha has taken Elijah's place, he soon has an opportunity to demonstrate prophetic power. People from the city, apparently Jericho, tell Elisha that though the city is nice enough, the water is brackish and the land unfruitful. Elisha has a remedy. He asks for a bowl of water that has been salted. Then he went to the city's spring and threw salt into it. Also, Elisha at that point declares that the Israelite God had made the water wholesome so that it would no longer have ill effects on the population. From that time on, the water was just fine. Elisha had passed his first test. That's in verse 22. We will treat the second part of Elisha's initial demonstration of prophetic power next week. That story occurs in verses 23 and 24. For now, though, a few comments are in order. It is difficult not to dismiss a story like this, given such fantastic descriptions. According to this account, Elijah left this world by going straight to God without bothering to die, just as Enoch in the book of Genesis had done. It was not all that uncommon to describe extraordinary people in terms of extraordinary events. Of course, any miraculous event is extraordinary. At the same time, the characteristics of an event like this seem to transcend an ordinary miracle. That is, if there is such a thing. The descriptions themselves suggest such an outlook. Elijah is said to have been taken up in a whirlwind, accompanied by a chariot of fire and horses of fire. The imagery itself is more suggestive than descriptive. It is evocative. Trying to conjure up precisely what Elijah saw is an exercise in futility. Certainly, a whirlwind and chariots and horses of fire are often associated with divine activity. Think of God's speaking to Job from the whirlwind, or tongues as of fire during Pentecost. Extraordinary divine activity can only be described with extraordinary imagery, even poetic imagery. Something like that seems to be the situation with which we are confronted in this amazing story of Elijah's leaving and Elisha's commencing his prophetic ministry. If you think this aspect of the story is curious as it is amazing, just wait till you see what we deal with next week. Go to my website, please, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I can contact you at the appropriate time. And if you have any questions you'd like me to address, write me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2. In that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.